In a dark, rainy city where life was busy and prejudice was in the air, one black woman took a ride that would change her destiny forever. The evening began as usual, but everything changed when she got into a taxi, unaware of what was waiting for her. The taxi driver, driven by hatred and prejudice, unleashed a vicious tirade of insults and then violence. Watch as the events unfold and the shocking aftermath of this attack. This case raises important issues about racism and justice, and we want to hear from you. Let us know your name and where you are watching this video in the comments. You are incredibly important to us. Your support helps us grow our channel and shine a light on important issues that affect us all. Share your thoughts, your voice really does matter. Enjoy watching. The city was slowly sinking into darkness as lights began to come on in the streets. The morning noise gradually died down, giving way to the evening rhythm of life. People were rushing about their business, but there was an air of anxiety in the air that was hard to explain. It was an evening when prejudice and hatred hid under the mask of the ordinary, but were about to break through to the surface. The streetlights softly illuminated the sidewalks, creating an illusion of safety, but in the shadows lurked unnoticeable fears and prejudices. With each passing minute, the streets filled with different characters, young couples rushing to a date, groups of friends laughing and joking, and loners lost in their own thoughts. Each of them was part of the cityscape, but each carried with them their own history, their own preconceptions and invisible barriers. That evening, in a neighborhood known for its diversity, a black woman named Amina waited for a taxi. She was full of hope and anticipation. Her life had changed, and this trip was supposed to be the beginning of something new. Amina dreamed of a future where her talent and ambition would be appreciated and she would not face barriers because of the color of her skin. When the taxi pulled up, Amina climbed into the back seat, full of optimism. The driver, a tall man with sharp features, did not look friendly. His cold gaze and frown made her wary, but she tried to push away the anxious thoughts. She was sure that this evening would go smoothly. As the car moved through the streets, Amina noticed the driver making ridiculous comments about the people passing by. His words were filled with prejudice and contempt. Amina tried to ignore it, but her heart began to beat faster. The dark tone was ringing warning bells. She knew the prejudice was lurking beneath the surface, but she had no idea how quickly it could surface. The taxi driver became even more aggressive as he continued the conversation, his voice growing louder and his words harsher. Amina felt fear grip her, like cold hands squeezing her throat. This was only the beginning of a long and terrible journey that would open her eyes to the darkness hidden in her own city. Outside, the light was fading and the night was about to reveal its dark secrets. Amina could not have known that this evening would be the turning point that would change her life forever and release the cries for justice that she was about to face. As the taxi sped through the streets, Amina tried to calm herself by listening to the music on the radio. However, her thoughts still wandered between her recent experiences and the driver's anxious behavior. With every turn and every press of the brakes, the tension in the car increased. She felt an inexplicable anxiety growing in her chest. The taxi driver, ignoring her silence, continued to pour out his prejudices about people of different races, about how they supposedly interfere with the order of society. His words, filled with hatred, pierced the air, and Amina felt herself being overcome by anger and helplessness. She understood that this trip could not only be unpleasant, but also dangerous. "You don't agree with me?" the taxi driver suddenly asked, turning to her with a contemptuous grin. "You're one of them, aren't you?" These words were the last straw. Amina finally decided to break the silence. "I don't understand what you're talking about. We are all people, and everyone has the right to their own life." The taxi driver laughed, but the laughter was joyless and cruel. Yes, I have rights. Don't you think that your right is a bit much?" he said, increasing the speed. "People like you shouldn't be driving here." Amina felt her fear turn to anger. She knew this conversation would lead to nothing good, but her stubbornness made her continue. "I will not remain silent when I hear this. Respect should be mutual, regardless of skin color." In response to her words, the taxi driver abruptly pressed the gas pedal and then turned to her, his eyes sparkling with hatred. "You obviously don't understand who you're talking to." His voice sounded threatening as the car pulled out onto the empty street, leaving the evening noise of the city behind. Amina felt cold sweat start to run down her back. Every second seemed like an eternity as she realized she was trapped. There was no way out, all the windows were closed and the doors were locked. She started looking for her phone, but at that moment the taxi driver braked sharply and she almost hit the back of the seat. "Are you going to tell me how to live?" he said. Jumping out of the car, he turned to her, threatening and raising his hand. Amina knew she had to act. She braced herself for protection, but fear gripped her. With each passing second, she realized that this was no mere chance encounter. This was the beginning of a nightmare that would change her life forever. The taxi driver came closer, and there was madness in his eyes. She felt her heart pounding, and everything around her seemed to slow down. In that moment, the world around her disappeared, leaving only her and this man, whose hatred tore through the silence. She knew she had to get out, but no matter where she looked, freedom seemed out of reach. In that moment, when her fear was at its peak, she realized that no words could stop this violence that was about to befall her. Amina took a deep breath, trying to calm her shaking hands. The atmosphere in the taxi was uncomfortable, growing heavier with each passing second. It was quiet inside the car, save for the occasional sounds of cars moving past and the patter of rain that had begun to fall from the sky. But to her, the sound was like a drumbeat of anxiety. She retreated into her inner world, trying to ignore the driver's scowl and his caustic comments. His hard features were menacing, and the hand that gripped the steering wheel looked as if it were ready to attack. Amina tried to look out the window, watching the buildings pass by, which seemed so distant and unattached to the reality she was currently experiencing. Every time she tried to focus on something else, the taxi driver would start his stream of insults again. His voice was full of contempt, and his words were an ominous melody that stuck in her head. He talked about how people like her were a nuisance, how the city was filled with those who did not value social rules. Amina felt her anger rising, but fear was also taking hold. She knew that a conflict with him could lead to unpredictable consequences. She tried to remain calm, but every look and word he gave her shook her confidence. "Why are you even here?" he snapped as he stopped at a traffic light. Turning to face her, his voice sounded like he was asking a question that was as much rhetorical as it was threatening. "This is no place for your kind." Amina looked into his eyes, trying to find a spark of humanity in them, but she saw only a black abyss of hatred. Her heart sank with the realization that she had become a victim of bias, simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I just want to get to my destination," she said with an effort, trying to remain calm. "Let's just do it." The cabbie laughed, and his laugh was full of venom. He sped up, and her fear grew with every mile they traveled. Every stop at a traffic light seemed like her last, every minute an eternity. Emotions were boiling inside her: anger, resentment, fear. She understood that this was not just a trip, it was a test that was testing her strength. She had to find a way to cope with this without losing herself. As they passed an abandoned building, Amina saw a look cross his face that she would never forget. It wasn't just contempt, it was a complete lack of human empathy, as if he viewed her as something to be disregarded. The realization crushed her. Suddenly the taxi driver turned to her, and there was a flicker of cruelty in his gaze that pierced her to the core. Amina felt a paralyzing fear grip her. She knew she had to fight back, but her strength was ebbing away. In this dark, hate-filled cage, she realized that her routine ride had turned into a fight for survival. With every meter they drove, the taxi driver became more and more aggressive, as if his hatred was coming alive. Filling the car, Amina felt the tension growing. The words he spoke were like sharp knives, tearing apart the silence in her inner world. "You know, I've always wondered how people like you can live in this city," he began, looking at her through the rearview mirror. His tone was mocking, and every word was threatening. "You take jobs from normal people and still think you have the right to be here." Each word he spoke ripped through the air, and Amina felt her heart beat faster. She tried to focus, not to give in to the provocation, but fear squeezed her chest. She knew his words weren't just insults, they were weapons meant to humiliate and break her. "You don't think anyone will take you into account, do you?" he continued, his voice growing louder. "Everyone knows you don't appreciate what you're given. That's an outrage, not life." Amina gritted her teeth, trying to suppress her emotions. She couldn't believe that the man behind the wheel was capable of such a thing. She had never encountered such open hatred. Anger boiled inside her, but she knew that staying safe was the most important thing right now. "Why do you think that?" she said, trying to sound confident. "I'm just here as a person, like anyone else." Ha! His laugh was full of contempt. You may be a man, but in the eyes of others you are just a shadow that drags all this dirt behind you. No one wants you around. His words were like a bolt from the blue, tearing her soul apart. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't want to show him her weakness. Amina clenched her fists, forcing herself to hold back. How can you say such things? She asked, feeling her voice tremble. We all have the right to respect. The taxi driver turned sharply to face her, and there was madness in his eyes. He wasn't just insulting her, he was trying to break her spirit. Respect? You don't even know what you're talking about, he shouted, his voice like the roar of a wild animal. You're just a freak of nature, not a human being. You're worthless. Every word he said penetrated her consciousness, leaving painful wounds in its wake. Amina wanted to scream, to throw herself at him, but she knew that would only make the situation worse. She tried to maintain her sanity, knowing that her life depended on her being able to withstand this verbal storm. Outside, the rain grew heavier, and the drops pounded the roof like the sounds of her own heart. She felt the darkness enveloping her, but inside, a fire of determination was burning. She couldn't let it win. You don't know who I am, she said, trying to sound calm despite the tremor in her voice. I won't let you break me. The cabbie chuckled, his laugh full of venom, but there was a dawning understanding in Amina. This wasn't just a fight against him. It was a fight against the system that supported such hatred. Every blow of his words made her stronger, and she knew she had to fight not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced something like this. This was only the first part of their encounter, and Amina knew that there were many more trials ahead. But at this moment, with every word of hatred, she grew stronger, preparing to face the storm that was coming her way. The taxi driver's verbal attacks grew more vicious, and Amina felt the world around her shrinking. She was trapped in the car like a cage, and every turn and every word only increased her sense of isolation. The outside world, full of bright lights and vibrant sounds, seemed unattainable and distant. In that moment, she realized that she was not just trapped, but in the grip of prejudice and hatred. The taxi sped through the empty streets, and Amina looked out the window, but instead of the familiar city landscapes, she saw only her own reflection, frightened eyes and a pale face that increasingly resembled a victim. With each passing second, her fear grew, like a wave that was about to cover her head. The taxi driver, noticing her condition, only grinned. You look like you're about to cry, he said with disdain. Is this your usual reaction when someone tells the truth? His words were like sharp blades piercing her consciousness. Amina felt panic rising in her. In this confined space, she was completely defenseless, and the very thought that she could become a victim of physical violence filled her heart with horror. She tried to believe in herself, but her inner voice whispered that there was no way out. Wherever she looked, she saw only the walls of this machine, heard only his voice, full of contempt and hatred. Every minute spent in this cage was torture, and she felt her strength leaving her. The taxi driver made a sharp turn onto a side street, and Amina realized that they were far from the main street she was heading for. There were no people or cars around, only emptiness and darkness. At that moment, fear took over her completely. Her thoughts swirled in chaos. What if he doesn't let me out? What if no one finds me? She began to move slowly towards the door, trying to do it unnoticed. Suddenly the taxi driver noticed her attempt. Where are you going? His voice became even more sullen, and there was a threat in his tone. You don't think you can just run away, do you? Amina froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew her instincts were screaming at her to act, but fear paralyzed her. She returned to her seat, tears welling up in her eyes. In that moment, she realized that this man was more than just a taxi driver. He was the embodiment of all the hatred and prejudice she had faced her entire life. Every thought of escape seemed insane to her. She was trapped not only physically, but also mentally. External circumstances pressed on her like a mountain, and Amina felt fear pulling her into the abyss. She understood that if he decided to attack, no one would hear her screams. The taxi driver began telling stories about unworthy people, but her mind no longer processed his words. She heard only the echo of her own thoughts. I have to survive. I have to find a way out. She decided that despite her fear, she would not allow him to strip her of her dignity. You're wrong, she said, trying to sound confident despite the trembling in her voice. I won't let you control me. The taxi driver stopped, his eyes gleaming with anger. He leaned closer, and in that moment Amina felt panic wash over her again. The urge to resist flared up inside her, but she knew she had to remain cautious. Outside, the night was growing thicker, and the darkness was becoming more and more oppressive. Amina knew that she was alone in this hell, and no one would come to her aid. However, even in this moment of isolation and fear, a spark of determination was brewing inside her. She knew that she had to fight for her freedom, despite all the obstacles. The darkness around her was consuming everything, and the silence in the taxi was becoming more and more oppressive. Amina felt her patience running out. The taxi driver's hateful words were no longer just insults, they were starting to turn into physical threats. A feeling was growing inside her that the boundaries of her patience were about to be violated. The taxi driver continued his tirade, and each new comment felt like a blow to her dignity. He spoke of the success he had achieved and the uselessness of her existence, of how her people were supposedly destroying everything good. Amina tried not to listen, but his voice was like a spell, making her feel more and more helpless. "You do understand that all your dreams are an illusion," he continued, heating up the situation with each word. "None of this will come true. You're in the wrong place." Amina tried to ignore his words, but her inner anger began to build like a storm about to erupt. A struggle flared up inside her. She wanted to respond, but she knew that it could lead to unpredictable consequences. Every look, every word he said pushed her to the edge, beyond which there was not only humiliation, but also violence. Finally, when he braked abruptly, Amina felt his rage reach its peak. She saw his hand rise for a moment, and the thought flashed through her mind, this is the moment when everything can change. She knew that if he decided to attack, she would have no chance. "You have no right to say that," she blurted out, and her voice sounded with unexpected force. "You don't know me, and you don't know what I can do." The taxi driver turned to her, his face contorted with hatred. There was more than anger in his eyes, but a madness that heightened her fear. He leaned closer, and in that moment, Amina saw him clench his fist. "You think your words matter?" he said, his voice menacing. "They're just empty words." At that moment, Amina knew she had reached the point of no return. She couldn't take it anymore. Her fear became a source of strength, and she felt a fire of determination ignite inside her. She wasn't going to remain a victim. She wasn't going to let him take away her dignity. "No, you're wrong," she screamed, her voice ringing in the confined space of the car. "I won't let you humiliate me." The taxi driver, as if not expecting such a reaction, froze for a moment, his face distorted with anger, and he exclaimed, unable to hide his fury, "Do you think I'm afraid of you? You're nothing." Amina felt his aggression growing and instinctively pressed herself against the door, but instead of fear, a spark of courage ignited in her heart. She realized that she had to take a step toward her freedom. "You think you can intimidate me with words and threats?" she said with a force she hadn't expected. "I won't let you take my humanity from me." The taxi driver, enraged by her challenge, began to shout and hit the steering wheel. His rage crashed down on her, and at the same moment he pulled his hand out of the window, raining insults on her. Each of his shouts was like a blow, but instead of breaking, Amina felt her inner boundaries begin to crack. Seconds felt like hours when the taxi driver finally stood up, sitting up in his seat to get even closer to her. He was about to cross the line. Amina knew that if she didn't stop him, the consequences could be catastrophic. At that critical moment, when the threat became reality, Amina took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. She looked into his eyes, and in that moment she felt her fear turn into determination. "I'm not afraid of you," she screamed, her voice full of rage. "I won't be silent." The taxi driver froze, not expecting such a reaction. His rage and hatred suddenly collided with her defiance, and at that moment tension hung in the air. Amina knew that this was not just a clash between two people, it was a struggle between two worlds, the world of hatred and the world of dignity. She could feel the power building inside her, and she knew she would not let this man take away her humanity. This was her limit, and she was willing to fight to protect herself. Amina ran out of the taxi, but her heart was still pounding with fear. She looked back and noticed that the taxi driver did not seem to be leaving her alone. His aggressive behavior continued to haunt her. She started running, trying to find a safe place. The streets around her were unfamiliar, and the feeling of uncertainty only increased her anxiety. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. It was him. Fear gripped her, and she increased her speed. The taxi driver caught up with her and grabbed her by the shoulder, stopping her abruptly. Amina felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to face him, her eyes full of determination. "Let me go!" she cried, trying to remain calm. Emotions were raging inside her, but she knew she had to be strong. He leaned closer, his voice threatening. "You think you can just leave?" Amina took a step back, feeling her fear collide with her determination. She was not going to give in. In that moment, courage arose within her, and she realized that she could not allow this conflict to continue. Gathering her strength, she pushed him and tried to go the other way. The taxi driver froze for a moment, surprised by her reaction. This gave her a chance to break free. She ran without looking back, feeling freedom becoming available again. With each step, her confidence grew. She knew she could handle the situation, and her goal was clear: to get to safety. She ran, and at that moment, all her fears began to recede, giving way to the determination to survive. Amina kept running, her heart pounding in her legs, carrying her away from the horror she had just experienced. She stopped to catch her breath and looked back. There was no one behind her, but the tension was still clinging to her body. She sat down on a park bench, trying to process what had happened. Thoughts raced through her head. Why did this happen? Why did he act like that? Her mind searched for an explanation, but all attempts to find logic in his actions were in vain. Tears welled up in her eyes and she couldn't hold them back. Amina felt vulnerable and confused. How could a situation that started as a normal trip turn into a nightmare? She never thought she would experience something like this. The people around her continued their business, and this only increased her feeling of loneliness. She felt as if an invisible wall had formed around her. People passed by, not noticing her condition, and this added even more misunderstanding to her internal conflict. Why did no one see what had happened? Amina tried to calm down and collect her thoughts. She knew she needed to get help, to tell them what had happened, but she was also scared. How will they react? Will they understand? These thoughts continued to torment her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she would not be understood, that her experiences would be undervalued. What if they say it's my fault? The tension inside her was not leaving her. Amina knew that she had to find the strength to speak up, to share her experience and make sure that it did not go unnoticed. But to do this, she had to pull herself together and understand that her feelings mattered, and that she had the right to protection and support. Gathering her thoughts, she took out her phone and dialed her friend's number. She needed to share what had happened and get the support she was desperately seeking. At the moment when Amina ran out of the taxi, several passers-by stopped and watched. They became silent witnesses to the incident, but no one dared to intervene. Each of them, in their own way, understood what was happening, but fear, uncertainty and social norms paralyzed their actions. Some people simply continued on their way, avoiding Amin's gaze. They did not want to face an unpleasant situation that they would rather leave behind. The thought flashed through their minds, "It's none of my business," and they hurried away to avoid being caught in the middle of a conflict. The others who remained looked at each other, discussing the situation in whispers, but no one stepped forward. They looked at the taxi driver, contorted in rage, and at Amin, who was struggling with her own fear, but instead of coming to help, they simply stood there, watching. There was a man in the crowd who had once worked for the police. He remembered his responsibility and how important it was to protect those who needed help. But the moment he saw what was happening, he was confused. What if I'm wrong? What if this is a misunderstanding? Thoughts raced through his head, and he remained where he was, not taking a single step. A group of women stood nearby, discussing their affairs. They stopped to watch, but instead of intervening, they began whispering among themselves. "It's terrible, but there's nothing we can do," one said. Their sympathetic words only confirmed the fact that they, too, felt helpless. Some witnesses felt guilty for not doing anything, but at the same time, their fear of possible consequences held them back. The internal conflict did not give them peace, and, ultimately, they chose to stay away. Soon the noise of the city filled the space again, and the incident gradually faded from view. But Amina was alone. Her world turned upside down, and those around her simply went about their business. They could not know how much this event had changed her life, or how long it would take her to recover from the experience. When Amina finally ran out of sight, The crowd was still discussing what had happened, but no one was making any moves to find out how to help. And it was this silence of witnesses, that left a deep wound in her heart, not only from fear, but also from a feeling of loneliness. After the incident, when Amina ran out of the taxi, there was silence. The people around who witnessed the conflict continued their business as if nothing had happened. This curtain of silence weighed heavily on the atmosphere, and the reasons for this behavior became clearer with each passing minute. Various thoughts arose in their minds, which restrained their actions. Many of them were sure that intervening could lead to an escalation of the conflict. What if he gets angry with me? They thought. Fear of the possible consequences made them speechless. For others, there was an internal conflict. They couldn't figure out if the situation was serious enough to intervene. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding, they reasoned, making excuses for their inaction. The words "I don't want to get involved in other people's business" were ringing in their heads, and this only increased their reluctance to act. There were also those among the passers-by who thought it was none of their business. Social norms, sometimes unforgiving, forced people to stay away. They thought, let the police handle it, or surely someone else will help. This false sense of security made them stay where they were, oblivious to the suffering of others. However, there were also those among the witnesses who felt guilty for not intervening. Later, when the incident was over, their discussions caused inner turmoil. Why didn't I go over? Why didn't I try to stop him? They tormented themselves. These thoughts haunted them, but they didn't lead to action, instead only increasing the feeling of hopelessness. Amina, far from the stage, still felt this silence like a heavy curtain. She could not get rid of the thought that her fear was visible, but no one dared to take a step forward. This silent support only deepened her feeling of loneliness and helplessness. The news of the incident soon became a topic of discussion on social media and local news. People began sharing their opinions, with many condemning the passers-by for their inaction. However, this only highlighted the contrast between the online discussions and the real-life silence that reigned at the time. Amina understood that this veil of silence often serves as protection for bystanders. They try to maintain their own safety and avoid conflict, but at the same time, this silence has become a symbol of indifference. She knew that this mindset had to be changed to prevent such incidents from happening again. This thought gives her strength. I have to speak up so that no one else ends up in the same situation. When Amina returned home, her body was exhausted and her mind was confused. She closed the door and leaned against it, feeling her heart still pounding in her chest. Emotions raged inside her mind: fear, anger, confusion. Everything that had happened seemed unimaginable to her, as if it had not happened to her. From the first days after the attack, Amina faced consequences that went beyond physical injuries. Every sound, every movement made her anxious. She began to be afraid to leave the house, afraid to meet someone who might remind her of that horror. On the street, she tried to stay away from people, preferring solitude, even as a feeling of isolation grew inside her. At night, the fear returned with a vengeance. Amina could not sleep. She imagined sounds that brought her back to that incident. She tossed and turned in bed, trying to find peace, but images of the aggressive taxi driver, his harsh words and threatening behavior kept appearing in her mind. These thoughts stopped only with the coming of the morning, when she realized that she had to go out again into the world that seemed dangerous to her. Gradually, Amina noticed that her emotional state was changing. She became more irritable and sensitive to criticism. Every little remark or even a joke was perceived as a threat. She felt that her surroundings were beginning to distance themselves. Her friends and girlfriends tried to support her, but she could not explain how much this incident affected her inner world. Negative thoughts about herself began to appear in her head. Maybe I did something wrong. I should have avoided this. This feeling of guilt worsened her condition. Amina realized that she needed to seek help to deal with these experiences. She began to search for information about trauma and psychological support, realizing that this path was the only way to return to normal life. Over time, Amina decided to see a therapist. This step was the first sign that she was serious about her intentions. During the first sessions, she shared her experiences, and this turned out to be a real relief. The therapist helped her realize that her feelings were normal, that she was not to blame for what happened, and that recovery is a process that requires time and self-care. Gradually, Amina began learning techniques to help her cope with anxiety. She learned to meditate and engage in physical activity, which helped reduce her stress levels. Her therapist also suggested keeping a journal so she could express her feelings and track her progress. Still, the road to healing was uneven. There were days when Amina felt strong and confident, and days when the fear returned. But with each meeting with a therapist and each step toward understanding her experience, she realized her power more and more. She knew she could overcome this, and perhaps even become a voice for others who were going through similar things. After the incident, Amina knew she had to take steps to ensure that the situation did not go unpunished. Sitting in her room, she decided to do what she thought would be the hardest thing to do: call the police. The difficulty was not only in her fear, but also in her uncertainty about whether she should do it at all. What if she was not taken seriously? What if her words did not matter? Taking a deep breath, Amina picked up the phone. She ran the number through her head several times before dialing. Her heart was pounding and her hands were shaking. Finally, she dialed the number and waited apprehensively. The call was nerve-wracking, but also necessary. The operator on the other end of the line answered, her voice professional and calm. Amina felt her fear ease a little. She introduced herself and, gathering her thoughts, began to describe what had happened. She tried to speak clearly as she described the incident, but the words came with difficulty. "I was in a taxi, and the driver started acting aggressively," she began, her voice shaking with excitement. The operator listened attentively, asking clarifying questions from time to time. Amina felt her confidence return when she realized that her words were being taken seriously. She described the taxi driver's behavior, his threats, and how he grabbed her arm. "I understand," the woman on the line replied. "We will send a patrol to your address. Please remain in touch and do not leave your location." Amina agreed, although her emotions were raging inside her. She didn't know what to expect. She knew it might not lead to immediate results, but the thought that she was taking a step toward justice gave her strength. The patrol arrived fairly quickly. Amina went outside and saw 2 police cars that had stopped nearby. Officers got out and began looking around and approaching her. They were friendly and introduced themselves. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, asked how she was feeling. Amina tried to explain what had happened. The police officers listened attentively, and she noticed that their reaction was full of genuine interest and understanding. They asked clarifying questions, trying to get as much information as possible. "We want you to know that your safety is our priority," one of the officers said. "We will definitely take your case." Amina felt relief when the officers began recording her statement. They weren't just listening, they were supportive, which helped her feel like she wasn't alone. They asked questions about whether there were witnesses, whether there were cameras on the street, and whether she was willing to provide more information. She remembered the bystanders who had witnessed the incident and told them about it. The police wrote down the information, promising that they would try to find witnesses. After Amina finished telling her story, the officers suggested that she go to her local police station to file a formal report. They explained that this would help them begin an investigation. Amina agreed, and at that moment, she felt like she was taking a step in the right direction. After the officers left, she stood in the street with mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was horrified by what had happened, but on the other, she was relieved that she had taken an important step toward justice. The call was not just a plea for help, but a symbol of her strength and willingness to fight for her rights. Amina's experience became a catalyst for deeper reflection on how race and ethnicity can shape society's perceptions and responses to similar situations. In the days following the call to police, she began to realize that her experience was part of a larger picture, one in which racial bias and stereotypes played a key role. Amina shared her experiences and feelings with her friends. They were supportive, but at the same time, they couldn't fully understand how race affected her experience. For some, it was just a misunderstanding that she could work through, but Amina knew the situation was more complex than just a confrontation in a taxi. She recalled how the taxi driver had reacted to her, a black woman. Not only had he been aggressive, but he had used words that were hateful and biased. This was not just a conflict between a customer and a driver. It was a manifestation of deep-rooted stereotypes and biases that existed in society. With each passing day, Amina became increasingly aware that people of a different skin color could have been in a similar situation, but with a very different outcome. She thought about how often incidents like hers went unnoticed or unpunished. Being in this position made her feel vulnerable and alone. Amina decided to back up her point with statistics and research. She discovered that black women and men faced far greater risks when interacting with law enforcement. Their words and testimony were often met with distrust, and they themselves could be the target of racial stereotypes and bias. This realization deepened her anger and resentment at a system that seemed to betray people of her race. Amina also thought about the silent witnesses of that day. How could they watch her suffer and not intervene? Why? Her thoughts returned to how racial identity could shape perceptions of a situation. Was there fear of the possible reaction of a taxi driver who might be white? Was there a habit of ignoring the suffering of people of a different race? She decided to talk to other women who had been through similar situations. Their stories echoed familiar themes: fear, distrust of the system, and a sense that their experiences weren't being taken seriously. They shared stories of how their race had been a barrier to support or understanding. That understanding had united them and given them strength. Amina knew she needed to not only talk about her experiences, but also share them with the community. She began writing articles and social media posts about her experiences and raising questions about racial bias. Her voice became part of a larger conversation about justice, equality, and the need to change the way society views race. This chapter of her life was not only about her personal struggle, but also about the struggles of many others. Amina realized that it was important to raise questions about how race affects the perception of situations and the reactions of others. She hoped that her story and experience would help others understand how serious these issues are and how they affect people's lives. When Amina learned that her case would be heard in court, she had mixed feelings. On the one hand, it was a relief to get justice and bring the perpetrator to justice. On the other, she was afraid of how society would react to this incident. The trial promised to be not only a legal test, but also a social one. Amina began following the news regarding her case. From the first publications, it was clear that the situation had caused a significant public outcry. Newspapers and news sites discussed not only the incident itself, but also broader issues of racial bias and violence. Some supported her, while others questioned her testimony and offered different versions of the events that took place in the taxi. The local community was divided. Some people who knew Amina expressed their full support, holding rallies and collecting signatures for a petition demanding that the taxi driver be held accountable. Their goal was not only to protect Amina, but also to draw attention to systemic problems of racial discrimination and violence. On the other hand, there were voices that questioned her testimony. A lively debate began on social media, with commentators arguing that Amina could have provoked the situation and that the taxi driver's aggression was the result of a misunderstanding. Such comments not only hurt Amina, but also demonstrated how easily bias can permeate the public consciousness. The trial attracted the attention of local media, which covered it from a variety of angles. Cameras often captured Amina's emotions as she walked into court. Her vacillations between hope and fear. She felt like she was on display. Her personal experience and trauma were the subject of public debate. One day, she saw a headline comparing her case to other violent incidents, highlighting how her story was connected to larger social issues. During the court hearings, Amina took part in interrogations and her testimony was heard. The taxi driver's aggressive defense attorney questioned her words, trying to portray her as emotionally unstable. This approach made Amina angry and indignant. She understood that victim blaming often occurs in the judicial system, when the victim is at the center of accusations. At the same time, however, community support was growing. Amina's supporters organized pickets outside the courthouse, demanding justice. Their slogans were full of energy and determination, and they brought together people who had also experienced racial discrimination. This solidarity helped Amina feel that she was not alone and that her fight mattered. As the sentencing began, the courtroom was tense. Amina sat with her hands in her lap, her heart pounding. She knew that her personal tragedy was part of a larger conversation about race and justice in society. Regardless of the outcome, this trial had already become a milestone, forcing people to talk about issues that had long been hidden. The judge, after handing down the sentence, emphasized that this was not only a case of violence, but also a case of racial equality and justice. His words became an important signal to society that such incidents should not be ignored. Amina realized that her story became a symbol of the fight for the rights and protection of people of all races. The outcome of the trial was the subject of discussion in the media and on social media. The public was again divided, but this time the debate was more constructive, and many people began to realize the need for change in attitudes towards race. For Amina, this was the first step towards justice, but she knew there was still much work to be done. When Amina's case went to trial, there was a great deal of attention paid to the evidence that could prove or disprove her story. Evidence was key, and it was the one that could help the court build a full picture of what happened that evening. Amina knew that the witnesses' voices would be important, and she was eager to hear their testimony. There were several people among the witnesses who witnessed the incident. Each of them had their own unique observations and opinions about what happened. The first to take the stand was a middle-aged man who, as it turned out, was waiting for a taxi near the scene. He was one of the first to see Amina enter the car. "I was standing and waiting for my taxi to pull up," he began. "Looking around the courtroom, I noticed that the taxi driver looked quite aggressive. He was shouting something at the girl, but I couldn't make out what it was. When they drove away, I felt uneasy." Amina listened to his words with hope. His testimony confirmed her feelings. The taxi driver really was aggressive. The man continued, "I saw them start arguing, and then when the taxi stopped, I saw him push her. I was shocked. I wanted to go over, but I was afraid he might attack me too." These words confirmed what Amina had said. Fear in witnesses can paralyze their actions. At that moment, Amina felt supported. She was not alone in her experience. Next up was a young man who was also waiting for a taxi. He described the moment when Amina ran out of the car. "I was nearby and heard screams. When she ran out, I realized something was wrong. She looked very scared. I wanted to go over, but I saw the taxi driver start chasing her. It was scary, and I didn't know what to do." The young man's words underscored how quickly the situation could escalate. His testimony added further evidence in Amina's favor, but he also expressed regret that he had not intervened. When the time came for the woman who had also witnessed the conflict, Amina felt a wave of excitement. This woman, an older woman with a kind face, described her feelings. "I was walking down the street and I heard loud voices. I saw a taxi driver yelling at a girl. She looked scared. I remember wanting to go over to them, but I thought they would sort it out themselves. Now I realize how wrong that was." Her words were spoken with regret and understanding. This woman, like other witnesses, realized that their inaction could have led to tragic consequences. The next one was the police officer who arrived at the scene. He described how he was called and what he saw when he arrived. "I noticed that the girl was in a state of shock. She told us what had happened, and we immediately began questioning witnesses. This was our priority. We understood how important it was to collect all the details." His testimony added legitimacy to Amina's case by demonstrating that the police had responded seriously. However, he also confirmed that there was no CCTV footage of the incident, which could have complicated the investigation. The evidence gathered became key elements in the process. Amina felt her heart fill with hope. Each witness spoke about what had happened, but more importantly, they acknowledged their role and what could have been done to protect her. After the witness interviews were over, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. Amina felt supported by people who had not only witnessed the incident, but were willing to talk about it. These voices, all in one place, created a powerful mosaic effect, highlighting the importance of public engagement on issues of violence and racial bias. The testimonies collected not only became important evidence in the trial, but also a signal to the community to speak up and act when they witness injustice. Amina knew that her voice and the voices of the witnesses would matter in the fight for justice and equality. When the moment came for the taxi driver to take the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Amina felt her heart beat faster. This moment was important not only for her case, but also for understanding how his version of events might affect public perception of the incident. The middle-aged taxi driver looked tense as he stood up to give evidence. His defense attorney, a confident and experienced lawyer, had prepared a series of questions designed to soften the situation and paint his client in a favorable light. The taxi driver was dressed in a smart suit, which contrasted with the image Amina had painted in her memoirs. "Please tell the court what happened that evening," the lawyer asked, his voice confident and insistent. The taxi driver, a little nervous, began to speak. "I had been working all night and was tired. When Amina got into the car, she immediately started acting aggressively. She said she didn't like my directions. The taxi driver's words sounded like an attempt to shift the blame onto Amina. He claimed that her behavior provoked him and created a tense atmosphere. The lawyer continued asking questions to deepen the topic. And what happened next? The taxi driver continued, describing how he felt Amina had become out of control. He spoke of how she had, he said, started shouting and threatening, making his words seem defensive, even though Amina already knew that was not true. I didn't want to fight, I was just trying to finish the ride. At one point she opened the door and ran out, and I didn't know what to do, he said, avoiding looking at the judge and jury. Amina noticed how the taxi driver's lawyer tried to create a victim image by appealing to the emotions of those present in the courtroom. This approach deeply infuriated her. She felt that his words distorted reality and tried to undermine her own rightness. The next step for the defense was to bring in other witnesses, the taxi driver's friends, who corroborated his version of events. Their testimony was aimed at showing that the taxi driver had never been aggressive and that all the accusations were the result of a misunderstanding. They claimed that Amina had been under the influence of alcohol, and that this had affected her behavior. This testimony, although questionable, was supported by the defense, who insisted that the taxi driver was not to blame for what happened. He spoke of the importance of looking at the situation from different angles and realizing that no one knows how events actually unfolded. Amina listened as his words, full of confidence, dispelled her own worries. Her thoughts returned to how difficult it was to talk about one's suffering when it was being questioned. She understood that the taxi driver's defense relied on the traditional stereotypes and biases that often arise in such cases. Finally, the defense attorney finished his line of questioning and the judge turned to the taxi driver. "Is there anything else you would like to add?" The taxi driver thought for a moment and then said, "I just want everyone to understand that I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just doing my job." These words sounded like a final statement that called into question everything Amina had experienced. Her heart sank with injustice as she realized that her experience could be dismissed or misinterpreted. This approach by the taxi driver and his defense became an important part of the trial, showing how different sides can perceive the same event in completely different ways. For Amina, it was a reminder that her voice and story matter, and that the fight for justice will continue, despite attempts to defame it. The chapter ended with the understanding that there are two sides to every story, but one side is often left without a voice. Amina was determined to fight for her truth. Despite the resistance she experienced from her defense, she knew that her experience was not only her own story, but also the story of many others who had faced similar difficulties. Amina's incident and trial, the public began to actively discuss issues of racism and violence. Inspired by her story, activists and ordinary citizens began to unite to express their position and draw attention to the problems faced by people of different races. Rallies and protests began to take place not only in the city where the incident took place, but also in other regions, where people began to express their discontent with racial discrimination. The slogans that were heard at the rallies reflected deep pain and a desire for change. Justice for Amina, no to racism, and we are all equal. Each poster was filled with passion and a desire to change the situation that many found themselves in. Amina watched all of this unfold through social media and news reports, her heart filled with pride and hope as she saw people uniting to fight injustice. She began receiving messages from strangers sharing their stories, showing that they, too, had experienced discrimination. These letters kept her spirits up and gave her the strength to continue the fight. Activists organized roundtables, workshops, and open discussions to educate the community about issues of racism and hate. These meetings raised important questions about how bias can affect society as a whole and the importance of uniting to combat it. Amina decided to be part of these discussions to share her experiences and support those facing similar challenges. It was at one of these events that she spoke in front of an audience for the first time. Sitting in front of the crowd, she felt a mixture of excitement and determination. As she began to tell her story, her voice shook with emotion, but she felt that every word mattered. She shared how her life had changed since the incident, and how she had come to realize that her experience was just one part of a larger struggle. The rallies continued to gain momentum. They attracted the attention of local media and activists from all over the country. In some cities, People organized rallies to support Amina and all those who had become victims of racial bias. Mass marches with music, poetry, and speeches took place. The events became real festivals of solidarity, where everyone could express their feelings and experiences. But the protests also faced resistance. Some opponents of the activism tried to disavow the protesters' actions, calling them riots or misunderstandings. Amina had heard these sentiments and knew that the fight would not end quickly. Hatred and prejudice ran deep in society, and it would take time to change. Still, the protests led to noticeable changes. In some cities, officials began to review police tactics and implement racial sensitivity training. This was the first step toward creating a safer, more inclusive environment for all residents. Amina felt that her story and the stories of others were beginning to be heard more loudly. In addition, social media has become a powerful tool for disseminating information and mobilizing. Hashtags such as #JusticeForAmina, #EndRacism, and #TogetherWeRise have gone viral, gathering millions of supporters around the world. Amina and other activists have used the platforms to share their experiences and call for action. Each new day brought new challenges, but also new hopes. Amina realized that her struggle was not just her own story, but part of a much larger struggle for justice and equality. She knew that a world against racism was not just a slogan, but a movement that required constant work and everyone's participation. With each new step the activists took, Amina felt her own voice becoming part of this larger choir, and this inspired her to take further action. Together, they fought for a world where racial bias no longer had a place, and where every person would have equal rights and opportunities. More and more people began to realize that racial bias was not just an individual problem, but a systemic phenomenon ingrained in the consciousness of society. Amina, observing the protests and public discussions, realized that understanding this aspect is important for real transformation. Bias is not just a set of stereotypes and prejudices, but also hidden beliefs that shape people's behavior. It permeates all areas of life, from education to healthcare, from justice to employment. These dark corners of the mind often go unnoticed, and as a result, lead to discrimination and inequality. Amina began researching how bias permeates everyday life. She read articles and studies that showed how stereotypes influence people's actions. For example, in the workplace, many employers tend to misinterpret candidates' resumes based on their name or race. Studies showed that candidates with non-English names receive fewer interview invitations, even if they are just as qualified. This revelation shocked Amina. She began to realize that her own experience was not unique. Many people had faced similar discrimination, and it was part of a bigger picture. She began spending time with other activists, discussing how to combat bias and create a more inclusive society. During these meetings, they talked about the importance of being aware of their own biases and stereotypes. Each shared personal stories in which they had experienced discrimination or witnessed bias. These conversations opened Amin's eyes to how deeply ingrained these beliefs can be. Even in people with good intentions, bias can manifest itself in unconscious actions and words. Amina understood that changing this would take time and effort. One of the initiatives they developed was creating racial sensitivity education programs. They wanted to convey to people that bias is not only a matter of bad intentions, but also an issue that requires self-reflection and understanding. The challenge was that many people are unaware of their biases. Research showed that even the most liberal and open societies harbor deep prejudices. Amina and her peers began using statistics and real-life examples to show how bias can manifest itself in practice and how it affects people. During these discussions, the activists encountered resistance. Some people denied that racial bias existed, believing that everyone should be judged on their own merits. But Amina knew that this simplification did not solve the problem. She was determined to explain how even unintentional actions could have a devastating impact on people's lives. As part of their campaign, Amina and her team began using social media to spread awareness and collect stories from people who had suffered from bias. They created videos and posts in which people shared their experiences, explaining how bias had affected their lives. These personal stories became a powerful tool for promoting awareness and empathy. Amina also began to draw attention to how bias affects the younger generation. It is important to discuss racism and discrimination in schools and universities so that students can become aware of their biases and learn to respect differences. She organized workshops in schools where students could talk openly about their experiences and learn to listen to each other. Public protests and activism were an important step in changing the perception of bias in society. Amina felt that their work was beginning to bear fruit, and that more people were opening their eyes to the dark corners of their minds. Every step forward was important to creating a more just and inclusive society. With each new story, each new conversation, they were getting closer to the point where bias would not just be a topic for discussion, but an issue that required action and change. Amina knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, and she was ready to go all the way to make the world a better place for future generations. As public protests swept the city and calls for justice began, Amina realized that her life would never be the same again. On the one hand, the public attention helped her feel supported, but on the other, the aftermath of the incident continued to affect her inner world. Recovery was not just a physical process, but also a deep emotional journey. The first days after the incident were filled with anxiety and fear. Amina tried to return to her normal life, but every action reminded her of what she had experienced. Simple things, like taking a taxi or interacting with people, caused anxiety. She felt her fears taking control of her life. One day, Amina decided it was time to seek help. She signed up for therapy, hoping that a professional could help her cope with what she had experienced. At her first meeting with the therapist, she talked about her feelings, how fear and anxiety were holding her back from moving forward. The therapist listened carefully, offering her space to discuss her experiences and emotions. "It's okay to feel vulnerable," she said. "It's important to understand that you're not alone. This is a process, and every step is part of your journey to recovery." With each session, Amina began to open up, realizing that her feelings weren't just a reaction to the incident, but a reflection of deeper experiences around racial bias and identity. She began to work on understanding her emotions, sharing her experiences and recognizing that the path to healing would not be easy. During therapy, Amina also explored ways to regain control of her life. She began keeping a journal, recording her thoughts and feelings. This not only helped her understand her emotions, but also notice the progress she was making. Each moment she wrote down became a step toward realizing her strength and determination. Amina began to master meditation and relaxation techniques. This became an important tool in combating anxiety. She learned to focus on the present moment, freeing herself from heavy thoughts about the past. With each passing day, she became more confident in her actions, and gradually fear began to give way to hope. An important part of her recovery was connecting with other victims of racial discrimination. She met people who had experienced similar events and could relate to her feelings. They shared their stories, and this created a sense of community. Amina realized that she was not alone in her struggle, and that together they could create a space for support and understanding. Each meeting was filled with emotional power. As Amina discussed her experiences, she realized that it was important not only to heal herself, but also to help others. She began participating in support groups where she could share her experiences and help others who were just beginning their journey to recovery. Amina also realized that recovery was not only a process within herself, but also her desire to make the world a better place for others. She decided to step up her anti-racism activism, turning her suffering into strength. Her goal was no longer just personal recovery, but also active participation in changing society. She began organizing events where people could share their stories and discuss bias and discrimination. These gatherings became a movement, uniting people of all races and ethnicities to create a more just and inclusive society. Amina knew her journey to recovery was just beginning, but she felt ready to move forward. She was determined not only to heal herself, but to be a voice for those who could not speak. Each new day brought hope, and Amina was ready to take on every challenge along the way to new beginnings. Over time, Amina noticed her confidence growing. She realized that recovery was not a linear process and that there would be good days and bad days. At times, old fears would return, but she now knew how to cope with them. Therapy, journaling, and support groups became her anchor, and she learned to turn to them during difficult times. One of the most significant events in her life was her decision to participate in an anti-racism campaign. Amina knew that this opportunity would not only give her a voice, but would also be a step toward her own healing. She wanted to show others that even after a terrible experience, you can find the strength to change. On the day of the action, Amina felt excited, but also determined. She arrived at the square where the participants were gathering and saw many people united by a common goal. Slogans, banners and loud voices created an atmosphere of hope and solidarity. Amina felt her heart beat faster. This was not just a gathering, it was a movement that sought justice and equality. When it was time to speak, Amina walked onto the stage. She felt the adrenaline rush through her, but instead of fear, she felt the support of the crowd. It was as if all her work, all her struggles, and all her experiences were coming together in that moment. She began to talk about her experiences, about how important solidarity and support are in such difficult times. Her voice was confident, and the more she spoke, the clearer her message became. She urged everyone to speak up, to not remain indifferent to the issues of racism and bias. Every word she spoke reflected her determination not only to heal, but to help others in the process. After her speech, the crowd erupted in applause. Amina felt her spirit strengthened by the support of those around her. This moment was not only the end of one stage for her, but also the beginning of a new one. She realized that her experience could inspire others and be part of a larger fight for justice. The next day, Amina received a flood of messages from people who were touched by her words. They shared their stories, talking about how her speech made them feel less alone in their struggles. It was exactly what she wanted, to create a space where people could support each other and talk about their experiences. With each new interaction, Amina felt her own scars begin to heal. She realized that recovery was not just a personal struggle, but also an opportunity to create change in society. She became more involved in events, helped others, and continued to share her experiences. Amina realized that she found meaning in her journey. Her story became not just her personal struggle, but part of a larger movement for equality and justice. This journey to recovery opened up new possibilities and gave hope not only to herself, but to others as well. With each passing day, she became more confident, ready to take on challenges and create change. It had been a long journey, but Amina now knew that new beginnings, full of hope and opportunity, lay ahead, and with each step, she felt that her voice and story mattered, and that together with others, they could change the world for the better. As time passes, Amina begins to realize that her story is not only a personal experience, but also an important lesson for society. Each event, each experience, forms a bigger picture that requires careful consideration. She decided to use her lessons as a basis for thinking about racism and justice. The first big lesson was realizing that bias exists everywhere, in small interactions and large systems. Amina began to understand that many people may not be aware of their biases, and that this doesn't make them evil, but it does require awareness and work on themselves. She noted that change begins with individual reflection and critical thinking about one's beliefs and actions. Amina also noticed that there is often a tendency in society to ignore issues related to racism. Many people choose to not notice or think that it is none of their business, but it is silence and inaction that contribute to the maintenance of existing systems of injustice. She realized that it is important to create space for open discussion of these topics so that people can realize that racism affects everyone. The next important lesson for Amina was the importance of solidarity. When she saw people coming together to support her and other victims of racial discrimination, she realized that collective power could make a difference. Protests, actions, public appearances, all of this was made possible by the unity of people who were ready to stand up for each other and fight for common ideals. Amina actively shared her lessons with others through workshops and discussion groups. She spoke about the importance of understanding and empathy, listening and considering the diversity of experiences. Each person has a unique story, and these stories can open eyes to issues that often remain invisible. She also realized that the systems that sustain racism and bias are deeply rooted in culture and institution. This means that combating racism requires a holistic approach. It's not just about changing public opinion, but also about rethinking laws, education programs, and policies. Amina became an advocate for active participation in politics, recognizing that change can only happen when they are part of the solution. She also began to raise questions about restoration and reconciliation, understanding that healing is not just about forgiveness, but a process that involves all parties. became key to her thinking. Amina emphasized that an important step toward justice is creating a space for conversation where the pain and suffering that has been caused can be honestly discussed. In conclusion, Amina realized that the lessons learned from her experience are of great value not only to her but to the entire society. It is a call to action to continue the fight for justice, learn from the mistakes of the past, and move forward to a brighter and more inclusive future. Every person can contribute to this cause, and it is through joint efforts that meaningful change can be created. She realized that her voice and story were part of a larger struggle. It wasn't just her personal story, it was a reflection of many voices seeking justice and recognition. Amina was ready to continue her journey, knowing that the lessons she learned would live on and inspire change in others. Amina's story ended, but her lessons and message lived on. Each step of her recovery became a symbol of strength and hope for others who faced bias and injustice. She realized that every voice matters, and that together they can make a difference. By gathering with like-minded people and sharing her experiences, Amina inspired many, calling them not to isolate themselves, but to act. In every speech she gave, every word she uttered, there was a determination and a strength that could influence the hearts and minds of those around her. Now, as she looked to the future, Amina knew that her story was not the end, but the beginning of a new journey, a journey that would not only honor her experiences, but also the opportunity to create a community based on respect, understanding, and justice. With each passing day, she believed more and more in the change they could make together. It was a difficult journey, but it was necessary, and in this journey, Amina knew they were not alone. Their fight for justice was just beginning. Dear viewers, it is very important for us to know your opinion about this story. Share in the comments what you think about what Amina faced. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your stories and thoughts are important to us, and we appreciate each of you. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We appreciate your support and being with us. Have a nice day.